Florence, a city known for its breathtaking art, rich history, and stunning architecture, was forever changed on the 4th of November 1966. The Orno River, which had peacefully flowed through the city for centuries, suddenly became a force of destruction, swallowing streets, homes, and even priceless works of art. It was a disaster of unimaginable proportions, one that caught nearly everyone off guard. The flooding didn't happen all at once. In the days leading up to the disaster, heavy rainfall had been pounding the region. The soil, already saturated from weeks of continuous rain, could no longer absorb the water. The river levels began to rise steadily, but at first there was little alarm. Florence, like many historic cities, had experienced minor floods before, but what was about to happen was unlike anything the city had seen in centuries. Upstream from Florence, two major dams, Lavane and La Pena, were struggling to contain the massive amounts of water flowing into them. On the 3rd of November, both dams were forced to release water at an unprecedented rate, sending a surge of floodwater rushing toward the city. By the afternoon, the civil engineering department had already issued warnings about an exceptional quantity of water moving downstream, but by then it was too late for meaningful action. The first areas to experience flooding were the low-lying neighborhoods near the riverbanks. Cellars and basements in districts like Santa Croce and San Frediano were the first to take on water. For many residents, this still didn't seem like an emergency. After all, water seeping into basements wasn't uncommon in older parts of the city. But by the time night fell, it became clear that this was no ordinary flood. Emergency calls flooded into the local police stations, with frantic villagers upstream reporting rising water levels at an alarming rate. The problem wasn't just the amount of water, but the speed at which it was moving. It wasn't a slow, creeping flood. It was a rushing, violent surge carrying debris, tree branches, and even parts of destroyed structures along with it. By the early hours of November 4th, engineers at the Valdarno Dam made a desperate decision. Fearing that the dam itself might collapse under the pressure, they released a massive wave of water downstream. What followed was catastrophic. The powerful current reached the outskirts of Florence in the early morning, traveling at speeds of nearly 60 kilometers per hour. Residents who had gone to bed unaware of the looming disaster woke up to find water already rising around their homes. By the time the sun came up, the city was in chaos. The Arno had overflowed, turning Florence into a massive lake. Streets became rivers, cars, market stalls, and even entire sections of buildings were swept away. The water moved with such force that even some of Florence's stone bridges were at risk of being damaged. Landmarks, centuries-old churches, and museums that had stood for generations were now drowning beneath the raging flood. As the water levels continued to rise, the city's infrastructure began to collapse. By 7:26 in the morning, gas, electricity, and water supplies were cut off to large portions of Florence. By 8 o'clock, even military barracks had been overtaken by the flood. Hospitals, already struggling to function, lost power as their emergency generators failed. Landslides blocked roads leading in and out of the city, making rescue efforts nearly impossible. Florence was now completely divided in two. Those on one side of the Arno could not reach the other, and with phone lines down, communication was limited. People were trapped on rooftops, waving desperately for help as the streets below turned into raging torrents. And for many, there was nowhere to go. But the worst was still to come. The rising floodwaters weren't just carrying debris, they were also spreading something far more dangerous: oil. The powerful current ruptured underground heating oil tanks, mixing thick black oil with the muddy water. This made the flood even more destructive, coating everything it touched in a toxic sludge that would take years to fully clean. By mid-morning, Florence was unrecognizable. The iconic Piazza del Duomo was underwater. Shops and businesses had been completely submerged. Priceless paintings, sculptures, and manuscripts were now floating in the flood, carried away by the unforgiving current. The people of Florence were left with only one choice: survive. Many waded through waist-deep, ice-cold water to help their neighbors. Others formed makeshift rescue teams, using whatever boats or floating objects they could find to save those trapped in their homes. But with the water still rising, many feared it would only get worse. As the floodwaters continued their assault, the full scale of the disaster became painfully clear. Florence was in crisis, and it would take the courage of its citizens and the help of the world to pull it back from the brink. As the sun rose over Florence on the 4th of November, 1966, The city was already in a state of catastrophe. Entire streets had disappeared beneath the raging floodwaters, homes were destroyed, and thousands of people were trapped with nowhere to go. But as the morning wore on, the true scale of the disaster became even more horrifying. For those who had survived the initial surge of water, the nightmare was far from over. The force of the flood had created a dangerous current, sweeping away anything in its path. Debris, broken furniture, and even entire sections of buildings were being carried through the streets, turning the city into an unpredictable and hazardous landscape. Those who tried to escape by wading through the water found themselves struggling against a relentless current, often only able to reach safety by clinging to floating objects or climbing onto rooftops. Rescue efforts were nearly impossible in the early hours of the disaster. Emergency services were overwhelmed, with roads blocked by landslides and floodwaters too strong to navigate. Even the fire department, trained for extreme situations, found itself unable to respond effectively. The historic streets of Florence, which had once been filled with tourists and locals enjoying the beauty of the city, were now an unrecognizable, debris-filled wasteland. The water itself presented an even greater threat. It wasn't just a flood of rainwater, it was a toxic mix of mud, sewage, and oil. The destruction of underground storage tanks had released thousands of gallons of heating oil into the flood, creating a thick, black sludge that coated everything it touched. Buildings, bridges, and even the priceless artwork stored in Florence's museums were now covered in an oily film that would make restoration efforts far more difficult. By mid-morning, it was clear that Florence's most treasured landmarks were in grave danger. The Uffizi Gallery, home to some of the world's most important works of Renaissance art, was at risk of losing irreplaceable pieces. In the Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale, Italy's most important library, the floodwaters had reached the storage vaults, where centuries-old books and manuscripts were now floating, soaked, and covered in mud. The Ponte Vecchio, one of Florence's most iconic structures, had miraculously survived the force of the rushing river, but the small artisan shops that lined it were completely devastated. As the flood progressed, those who had once doubted the severity of the storm were now facing a grim reality. Many residents had chosen to stay in their homes, believing the waters would recede quickly, but instead the flood continued to rise, leaving thousands stranded. For some, their only option was to break through rooftops to escape the rising water. Others, trapped inside buildings, desperately signaled for help from windows and balconies, hoping someone would come to their aid. The lack of communication made the situation even worse. With phone lines down and power outages across the city, it was nearly impossible for residents to call for help. Many had no way of knowing what was happening beyond their immediate surroundings. Was the flood still rising? Had help arrived? Was there anywhere safe to go? These were questions no one could answer. Despite the overwhelming destruction, acts of bravery and solidarity began to emerge. Strangers helped each other escape flooded buildings, carrying those who could not swim or navigate the treacherous waters. Shop owners, despite their own losses, worked together to salvage what they could, passing valuables to higher ground in a desperate attempt to save their livelihoods. Those who had boats or makeshift rafts worked tirelessly to transport people to safety, even as the current threatened to pull them under. As the day went on, government officials scrambled to respond, but with roads blocked and infrastructure crippled, there was little they could do immediately. The military was called in to assist, but even their resources were stretched thin. It was becoming clear that Florence would need more than just local efforts to recover from this catastrophe. It would require international assistance, expertise, and a level of restoration work that had never been attempted before. By the evening of the 4th of November, Florence was a city in crisis. Thousands of families were homeless, their possessions lost to the flood. Businesses that had stood for generations were reduced to ruins, but perhaps most devastating of all was the loss of the city's cultural heritage. Museums, libraries, and churches, places that had preserved Florence's history for centuries, were now left in ruins, their priceless treasures buried under layers of mud and oil. Yet even in the face of such overwhelming destruction, the people of Florence refused to give up. The flood had tested the city in ways it had never been tested before, but the response in the days to come would show the world that Florence's spirit was far stronger than the forces of nature that had tried to bring it down. As the floodwaters in Florence slowly began to recede on the 5th of November, 1966, the true devastation became painfully clear. Streets were unrecognizable, buried under thick layers of mud and debris. Cars were overturned, buildings were gutted, and in many places, the air was thick with the smell of oil and sewage. The damage was not just physical, it was emotional. Florence, a city known for its beauty and history, now looked like a war zone. For those who had survived the terrifying rise of the water, the ordeal was far from over. Thousands of families had lost everything. Their homes were either severely damaged or completely uninhabitable, filled with sludge and contaminated by oil. Many people had no choice but to seek shelter in temporary relief centers, churches, or the homes of those lucky enough to remain dry. Basic necessities like food, clean water, and medical supplies were scarce, and with transportation routes still blocked, getting aid into the city was a massive challenge. One of the most heartbreaking losses was to Florence's cultural heritage. Inside the Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale, one of Italy's most treasured libraries, the destruction was overwhelming. Millions of books and manuscripts, some dating back centuries, were soaked through with muddy water. Many pages were so delicate that even touching them caused further damage. Historic churches, including the Basilica of Santa Croce, were in ruins. Frescoes, paintings, and sculptures that had survived for generations were now covered in grime, some completely dislodged from their original places. The loss was immeasurable, and the question on everyone's mind was, could Florence ever recover? In the midst of despair, however, something remarkable began to happen. People from all over Italy and beyond started arriving in Florence, determined to help in any way they could. Among them were students, historians, artists, and volunteers from around the world, later known as the Mud Angels. They came armed with buckets, sponges, and an unwavering determination to save Florence's treasures. The work was grueling. Thousands of people spent hours carefully removing books from the library, peeling apart wet pages one by one and laying them out to dry. In museums and churches, teams worked tirelessly to wipe away oil from paintings and lift statues out of the mud. Every effort was made to preserve what could be saved, but time was against them. Some pieces were so fragile that they started to disintegrate before restoration efforts could even begin. Outside of the cultural institutions, Florence's residents were also trying to rebuild their lives. Shop owners dug through the wreckage of their businesses, hoping to salvage anything of value. Homeowners shoveled mud from their doorways, determined to reclaim what remained of their property. The city's hospitals, still struggling with the aftermath of the disaster, treated cases of infections and illnesses caused by contaminated water. While the local government did its best to coordinate relief efforts, it quickly became clear that this was not a disaster that Florence could recover from alone. Appeals were made for international aid, and soon resources started to trickle in. Other European nations sent emergency funding and supplies, while conservation experts from around the world offered their skills in restoring damaged artworks and manuscripts. Even private citizens, moved by the plight of Florence, donated whatever they could to help the city rebuild. Despite these efforts, there was no quick solution to the crisis. Florence had suffered not just a temporary flood, but a catastrophe that would leave scars for decades. Many of the businesses destroyed by the flood would never reopen. The families who had lost their homes faced an uncertain future, and the priceless artifacts damaged by the water and oil would take years, if not lifetimes, to fully restore. By the end of the first week after the flood, Florence was still in chaos, but the determination to recover was stronger than ever. The people of the city, along with thousands of volunteers, had already begun the long process of rebuilding. There was still a monumental amount of work ahead, but one thing was certain: Florence would not be abandoned to the flood. In the weeks following the flood, Florence faced the monumental task of rebuilding. The immediate crisis had passed, but the city was far from recovery. Piles of debris lined the streets, and the thick, oily mud left behind by the floodwaters hardened like cement, making cleanup even more difficult. Residents, volunteers, and workers labored tirelessly, scraping layers of filth from the city's historic stonework and hauling away ruined furniture, books, and artwork. The Italian government declared a state of emergency and allocated funds to help the city recover, but the damage was overwhelming. The economic loss was staggering. Thousands of businesses had been wiped out, and thousands of families were left with nothing. Banks and financial institutions worked to provide relief, offering low-interest loans and financial assistance to those affected. However, for many small business owners and local artisans, the flood meant the end of their livelihoods. The city's economy, deeply rooted in tourism and trade, took a heavy hit. The cultural loss was equally severe, The extent of the damage to Florence's historical treasures was unlike anything the art world had ever seen. Some paintings and sculptures had been shattered or washed away entirely, never to be recovered. Books and manuscripts from the Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale and other archives remained at risk of disintegration. The flood had coated delicate frescoes and priceless paintings with a mixture of water, oil, and mud, making restoration incredibly complicated. But Florence refused to be defeated. As international aid poured in, restoration efforts gained momentum. Experts from across the globe came to help. Using innovative conservation techniques to rescue and preserve damaged artworks, laboratories were established to carefully clean and restore pieces that had been thought lost. The flood also sparked a new era in the art conservation field, leading to advancements in techniques that are still used today. One of the most ambitious efforts was the restoration of Cimabue's crucifix, an iconic 13th century painting that had absorbed so much water, it was nearly destroyed. Specialists spent years painstakingly reconstructing what they could, and while the damage was irreversible, their work ensured the piece would not be lost entirely. The same dedication was applied to countless other works of art, manuscripts, and historical artifacts. As the months passed, Florence began to rebuild, but the scars of the disaster remained. Many families who had lost their homes struggled to return to normal life. The once bustling markets and businesses slowly reopened, but not all of them survived. The city's infrastructure, including roads, bridges, and public services, required extensive repairs. Some of the most flood-damaged areas took years to fully recover. The Orno River, which had brought such devastation, became a symbol of both destruction and resilience. In the years after the flood, Florence invested heavily in flood prevention measures. Dams and reservoirs upstream were reinforced, and new drainage systems were put in place to better manage rising water levels. The disaster had exposed the city's vulnerabilities, and officials were determined to ensure that such a catastrophe would never happen again. Today, the memory of the 1966 flood lives on in Florence. Markers throughout the city indicate how high the floodwaters rose, a sobering reminder of the disaster that once submerged the streets. Survivors still share their stories, and the Mud Angels are remembered for their extraordinary efforts. The flood left an indelible mark on Florence, changing the city forever. But in the end, Florence endured. Through the determination of its people, the generosity of volunteers, and the support of the world, the city rose from the depths of destruction. Though much was lost, much was also saved, and the spirit of Florence remains as strong as ever. The 1964 Alaska earthquake, also known as the Great Alaskan Earthquake or the Good Friday Earthquake, was a devastating natural disaster that struck Alaska on the evening of March 27, 1964. The quake occurred at 5:36 p.m. Alaska Standard Time and is remembered as one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded. With a magnitude of 9.2, it remains the largest earthquake in North American history and the second largest globally since modern seismography began in 1900. This disaster took place in the south-central region of Alaska, affecting numerous cities and towns, including Anchorage, Seward, and Valdez. It lasted for nearly 4.5 minutes, but the destruction that followed was catastrophic. Massive ground fissures, landslides, and collapsing buildings wreaked havoc on the area, while a series of deadly tsunamis triggered by the quake caused further devastation along the Alaskan coastline and beyond. The backstory to this earthquake involves the slow but immense pressure that had built up between two tectonic plates, the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate. Over centuries, these plates had been pushing against each other, creating enormous stress deep beneath the Earth's surface. When that pressure finally released on that Good Friday in 1964, the impact was felt far and wide, not only in Alaska, but also in places as far away as Japan and California. In the days leading up to the quake, there were no clear signs or warnings. The people of Alaska, much like the rest of the world, were caught completely off guard when the Earth began to shake violently that evening. The Alaska earthquake of 1964 was caused by the movement of the Pacific and North American tectonic plates. Alaska sits on the boundary between these two plates, which are part of the larger Pacific Ring of Fire, an area known for frequent seismic activity. For centuries, the Pacific Plate had been slowly pushing beneath the North American Plate in a process called subduction. As the plates moved, immense pressure built up where they met, and by March of 1964, that pressure was at its breaking point. On March 27th, the stress that had been accumulating beneath the Earth's crust was suddenly released, leading to the massive 9.2 magnitude earthquake. The rupture occurred about 15 miles below the surface, and it stretched across an area roughly 500 miles long and 125 miles wide. The force of the earthquake caused the ground to shake violently, and in some places, the land rose or sank by as much as 38 feet. In the first few moments of the quake, the ground motion was so intense that it made standing or walking impossible for anyone caught outside. Buildings swayed, roads cracked, and entire neighborhoods shifted as the ground beneath them heaved. As the earthquake continued for more than 4 minutes, it became clear that this was no ordinary tremor. People across Alaska were experiencing a catastrophe unlike anything they had ever seen. While the shaking was terrifying, the real damage was still to come. In the hours following the earthquake, massive aftershocks, some of them as strong as magnitude 7, continued to rattle the region, deepening the destruction. The impact of the 1964 Alaska earthquake on cities and towns was nothing short of catastrophic. Anchorage, Alaska's largest city, was hit particularly hard. Buildings that had once stood tall crumbled under the force of the earthquake. Entire sections of the city were leveled as the ground split open and buckled. In some neighborhoods, houses were ripped apart as the land beneath them shifted dramatically. The city's downtown area saw significant damage, with large structures collapsing and streets becoming impassable due to deep cracks and fissures. Seward, a small town located near the epicenter, experienced unimaginable devastation. The earthquake triggered landslides that tore through the town, and within minutes, fires broke out as fuel tanks exploded. But the worst was yet to come. Minutes after the earthquake, a massive tsunami hit the town, washing away buildings, docks, and everything in its path. The water surged through the streets, dragging debris and leaving a trail of destruction. In Valdez, another coastal town, the earthquake's impact was equally devastating. A section of the waterfront slid into the sea, taking homes and buildings with it. Valdez also faced a terrifying tsunami that swept away parts of the town. Waves as high as 200 feet hit the coastline, and residents who had survived the initial earthquake now faced the deadly power of the sea. Kodiak, located further south, also suffered from the earthquake's impact. The powerful shaking caused severe damage to the town, and within minutes, the tsunami hit, destroying homes and businesses. The water rose rapidly, submerging large areas and leaving destruction in its wake. The port, a vital part of the town's economy, was wiped out as the tsunami waves obliterated docks and boats. Beyond the immediate destruction, the earthquake also caused landslides and avalanches across Alaska's rugged terrain. Whole mountainsides collapsed, and in remote areas, entire forests were flattened. The impact was felt far beyond Alaska, with shaking reported as far away as California and Japan. The aftermath of the 1964 Alaska earthquake was as challenging as the disaster itself. The destruction was widespread, leaving thousands of people without homes, businesses in ruins, and entire communities cut off from the outside world. In Anchorage, nearly every major building had been damaged or destroyed, leaving residents to grapple with the loss of their homes, schools, and workplaces. Temporary shelters were quickly set up to house those who had been displaced, but the scale of the damage meant that recovery would take years. One of the most devastating effects of the earthquake was the destruction of infrastructure. Roads and bridges were wiped out or severely damaged, making it nearly impossible to reach some of the most affected areas. The main highway connecting Anchorage to other parts of Alaska had collapsed in many places, and in the coastal towns, the destruction of ports and harbors left communities isolated. Relief efforts were hampered by these challenges as rescuers struggled to reach those in need. The U.S. military played a crucial role in the disaster response, deploying resources to help with search and rescue operations and to deliver supplies to the hardest-hit areas. Military planes and helicopters flew over remote parts of the state, dropping food, water, and medical supplies to isolated communities. Naval ships were sent to coastal towns like Valdez and Seward, where the combination of the earthquake and the tsunami had caused near-total devastation. The psychological impact on the people of Alaska was profound. Many who had survived the earthquake were left traumatized by the loss of loved ones, homes, and livelihoods. The constant aftershocks, some of which were strong enough to cause further damage, kept the population in a state of fear and uncertainty for weeks after the initial earthquake. In total, more than 100 aftershocks were recorded in the first 24 hours alone, and they continued for months, adding to the already immense sense of unease. As the initial shock wore off, the long process of rebuilding began. Volunteers and relief organizations from across the country came to Alaska to help with the recovery efforts. Engineers and construction crews worked tirelessly to repair the infrastructure, rebuild homes, and restore vital services. But despite these efforts, the full recovery would take years, and some of the damage, particularly in coastal areas like Valdez, was so severe that entire communities had to be relocated. In the years following the 1964 Alaska earthquake, the state gradually rebuilt itself, but the scars of the disaster were long-lasting. The earthquake left an indelible mark, not just on the land, but on the people of Alaska, who had to adapt to the new reality of living in a region with such immense geological power. Buildings and infrastructure were redesigned to be more earthquake-resistant, and new safety protocols were developed to ensure that communities would be better prepared for future disasters. One of the most important changes that came out of the earthquake was a greater understanding of seismic activity, particularly in Alaska. Scientists from all over the world flocked to the state in the aftermath of the disaster, studying the effects of the earthquake and the tsunamis that followed. Their research led to important advances in the field of seismology, including the development of better monitoring systems that could provide early warnings of future quakes. This knowledge would go on to inform earthquake preparedness efforts not just in Alaska, but in other earthquake-prone regions around the world. For many of the survivors, the memories of March 27, 1964, never faded. The earthquake had taken lives, destroyed homes, and reshaped entire communities, but it also brought out the resilience and strength of the Alaskan people. Stories of courage, sacrifice, and solidarity became part of the collective memory as residents supported each other through the darkest hours and rebuilt their communities from the ground up. The earthquake also left a legacy of awareness and preparedness. Public education campaigns were launched to ensure that Alaskans knew how to respond in the event of another major quake. Regular drills and preparedness exercises became part of life in schools and workplaces across the state, ensuring that future generations would be ready if and when disaster struck again. In the end, the 1964 Alaska earthquake remains one of the most powerful natural disasters in U.S. history. It reshaped not just the physical landscape of Alaska, but also the mindset of its people, creating a legacy of resilience and preparedness. While the state has seen other disasters in the years since, none have left a mark quite like the Good Friday earthquake, a day that forever changed Alaska. Laughter is usually a sign of happiness and joy, something light and uplifting. But imagine if laughter became something completely different, something that could disrupt entire communities, shut down schools, and leave doctors baffled. That's exactly what happened in 1962 in Tanganyika, which is now known as Tanzania. The country had just gained independence the previous year on December 9th, 1961, and was going through a time of big social changes. What began as a simple outbreak of laughter soon grew into a strange and disturbing epidemic that gripped villages and towns for months. This wasn't just laughter for fun, it was uncontrollable, exhausting, and deeply unsettling. Over the next few parts, we'll explore what really happened during this mysterious event, how it spread, and what it might teach us about the power of the human mind. This strange epidemic began in a small village called Kashasha, near Lake Victoria. On January 30th, 1962, just 3 schoolgirls at a mission-run boarding school started laughing, and they simply could not stop. Their laughter was uncontrollable and often mixed with crying and obvious distress, which made it clear this wasn't ordinary amusement. Within days, the laughter had spread to 95 of the 159 students at the school. Teachers watched helplessly as the students became unable to focus on their lessons. The situation escalated so rapidly that by March 18th, less than 2 months later, the school was forced to close and send the students home. Officials hoped this would end the outbreak, but instead it sparked something far bigger, allowing the laughter epidemic to spread beyond the school and into the wider community. Calling it a laughter epidemic doesn't capture how complex and troubling the situation really was. The uncontrollable laughter was just the most visible symptom, but it rarely brought joy. Many affected people experienced intense bouts of crying alongside the laughter, sometimes switching rapidly between the two. Physical symptoms were common, including severe headaches, fainting, and difficulty breathing during the laughing fits. Some even developed rashes. Beyond the physical, many reported feelings of deep fear and restlessness. Some ran aimlessly or became aggressive when restrained. Patients described sensations like being chased or having strange movements inside their heads. These episodes could last from a few hours to as long as 16 days and could return repeatedly after periods of normalcy. This was a frightening and exhausting experience that went far beyond what anyone expected from an outbreak of laughter. When the Kashasha school finally closed on March 18, 1962, the laughter didn't stop. It traveled with the students back to their home villages. Rather than ending the outbreak, sending the girls home caused it to ripple outward, sparking new cases in nearby communities. One of the earliest and largest secondary outbreaks happened in Shamba, a village about 55 miles from Bukoba, where many of the affected girls lived. Between April and May of that year, approximately 217 people out of a population around 10,000 experienced similar uncontrollable laughter and distress. These cases were mostly young adults and school children, including both boys and girls. The epidemic continued to spread in a pattern closely following the students' movements. When a student from the Iramashenye Girls Middle School near Bukoba returned home, another outbreak erupted there, affecting nearly a third of the students. Kanyangareka village also saw its own wave after a student carried the condition home. In total, the epidemic affected up to 1,000 people and forced 14 schools to shut down for periods ranging from 6 months to 18 months. Life in these areas was severely disrupted, with daily routines ground to a halt. Interestingly, the epidemic predominantly impacted young people, especially girls, while adults and teachers largely remained unaffected, deepening the mystery and anxiety surrounding the outbreak. As the laughter epidemic spread and schools remained closed, medical professionals scrambled to understand what was happening. Teams of doctors and researchers launched investigations, determined to find a physical cause behind the bizarre symptoms. They collected blood samples from affected individuals and those who had recovered, but tests revealed no viruses or infectious agents. Researchers explored environmental factors too, testing water and food supplies for toxins or contamination. One theory suggested poisoning from plants like datura seeds, but the symptoms and patterns didn't match up. Importantly, the illness didn't spread through contaminated food or water, but seemed to follow social interactions, which baffled investigators. Despite extensive testing and analysis, no clear physical cause was identified, leaving the medical community perplexed. The absence of any infectious or toxic agent intensified the confusion and fear among both villagers and officials, deepening the mystery of the laughter epidemic. With no physical cause found, experts turned their attention to psychological explanations. The leading theory became mass psychogenic illness, sometimes called mass hysteria, where psychological distress manifests as real physical symptoms in groups of people. Importantly, those affected were not pretending. Their symptoms were genuine and could be severe. To understand why this happened in Tanganyika, it's key to look at the social context of the time. The country had just gained independence from British rule in December 1961, bringing major changes and uncertainty. Young people in mission schools faced increased pressure to succeed under stricter rules and new expectations. This mix of cultural tension, stress, and fear created a perfect psychological storm. The laughter epidemic can be seen as a collective response to this overwhelming anxiety, a way for the mind to express what words couldn't. The laughter epidemic didn't just stay in one place, it spread rapidly across villages and schools. This wasn't because of a virus or infection, but due to the way people influence each other's behavior, especially in tight communities. Seeing classmates or neighbors laughing uncontrollably could trigger the same reaction in others, especially when everyone was already stressed and anxious, and young people, particularly teenagers, are more susceptible to this kind of social influence because fitting in is so important to them. In this case, laughter acted like a chain reaction, passing from person to person, almost like an emotional epidemic. Adults with different social roles and coping mechanisms mostly remained unaffected. This pattern highlights how powerful our minds and social environments are in shaping physical experiences, especially in times of collective stress. Just as suddenly as it began, the laughter epidemic in Tanganyika gradually faded over the next 6 to 18 months. No specific medical treatment ended it. Instead, it slowly ran its course, leaving behind disrupted communities and schools. 14 schools had closed, some for over a year, deeply affecting the education of hundreds of students. While nobody died directly from the epidemic, many struggled with concentration and emotional distress long after the laughter stopped. Today, this event remains one of the most well-documented cases of mass psychogenic illness, showing how psychological stress can manifest as physical symptoms on a large scale. Despite the mass psychogenic illness explanation, many questions linger about why laughter, of all symptoms, dominated and how it moved through these communities so intensely. The 1962 laughter epidemic reminds us of the incredible and sometimes mysterious ways our minds, bodies, and societies are connected, especially during times of upheaval and uncertainty.